Okay, students, this is your teacher, Lisa Kearney Anderson, and I am going to be talking to you about motor physiology. So when we talk about a motor system in humans and non-human primates, we have three parts of the motor system. We have an upper level, a middle level, and a lower level. So the upper level, we have primary motor cortex and some association cortices that we call the premotor and supplementary motor cortex. So it's going to, this is very important because there's a major motor pathway that starts here, and it's called the corticospinal tract. Most of our motor tracts actually start in the brainstem, but there is one that starts in the cortex, and it is so darn important. It's that corticospinal. And so the primary motor cortex is basically the initiation of the movement and controlling muscles and that kind of thing. But then we really need that premotor cortex because there are all these things that we need to do. A lot of what we do is getting our hand to a target, getting our hand to the pencil, picking up the pencil, getting our hand and the pencil to the piece of paper, coordinating the hand as we're writing something. Oh my goodness, that's a lot of what we do. And so that's our highest level of control. Now, the middle center of control is the brainstem and some other structures, the cerebellum, the basal nuclei, which, well, actually when I was in school we called them the basal ganglia. It really makes more sense to call them the basal nuclei because it's gray matter in the central nervous system. So huge number of motor tracts coming from the brainstem, motor behavior that's reacting to sensory input, and then we need lots of help from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei to figure out how we're going to implement the commands coming from the cortex. So which muscles exactly do we need to activate? What order do we need to activate them in? How do we correct things along the way to make sure the motor activity that we want to perform is really what we perform? And then when we talk about the lower center of control, that's mostly the spinal cord. It's very important that we not think of the spinal cord as simply an elevator where information goes up and down. There's all kinds of coordination going on. Spinal reflexes are very important. And then we have groups of neurons in the spinal cord that are called central pattern generators. And that makes the spinal cord actually a very sophisticated structure. So here's a diagram from your textbook. So we have these higher centers. So the cortex and the premotor cortex is then going to send a command, and the middle centers have to figure out how to execute those commands. So notice there's a lot of interaction between the basal nuclei and the thalamus, and then the thalamus goes up to the cortex, a lot of interaction between the cerebellum and the brainstem. And then with our lower center, there's a little bit of brainstem, mostly spinal cord. There are parts of the brainstem that we think of as an extension of the spinal cord. And then this is the final pathway, talking to the muscle fibers and getting information, sensory information back from the periphery. So here's a nice table from your textbook talking about what all of these systems do. So the higher centers, they form the complex plan. What is it that we want to do? What are the commands? These are motor structures, so supplementary motor areas, association cortices, and that motor cortex. So the middle level, here's the plan. How are we going to convert it into smaller programs or even smaller, you might call them subroutines? How are we going to activate the muscles? What position do we need our joints to be in? That sort of thing. So sensory cortices, cerebellum, basal nuclei, and some brainstem nuclei. And then the local level is actually activating the muscle and actually getting the job done, carrying out the level. So all our spinal reflexes would be located on the lowest level as well. So here's a picture of your brain. If we divide this, these are the motor cortices, these are the sensory cortices. So the primary motor cortex is basically where simple movements come from. Premotor and supplemental is right in front of that. And the back here, this is the sensory information coming in from the periphery. If we look at a sort of a frontal section, there are a number of things we see. So this is the gray matter. So the cerebral cortex all around here. Then you notice we have some white matter in these areas. So those are myelinated axons, major white matter, the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres. And then we have all these things together that we would call subthalamic nuclei, subcortical nuclei. So this is gray matter that's below the cortex. So parts of the basal ganglia, the subthalamic nucleus, the thalamus, and those kinds of things. We also see some lateral ventricles here. We see the third ventricle. We see these are nuclei of the hypothalamus. There's the pituitary gland, some other structures that you might be familiar with. So we have an upper motor center, a middle center, a lower center. What do they have in common? All of them have a map. That's called somatotopic organization, meaning there's a map of your body. There's a map of you in each part of the motor system. Every level gets sensory information. You cannot make motor decisions unless you know where you are, if you're sitting or standing, what position your joint's in, what's the target you're trying to get to. So sensory information is very, very important for motor decisions. Higher levels can control what's coming from lower levels, and all of the areas are very much connected. So we need to talk about what's going on with the motor system, and I'm going to start from the bottom and come up. So we think about the lower level of our motor system as the final common pathway. So you see sensory information coming into the spinal cord. You see information from the cortex, other levels of the spinal cord, from other muscles. All of those are converging on a common pathway. So this is very much a converging type of neuronal pool. A lot of what we know about the spinal cord comes from an animal model called the decerebrate cat. So the cat has an operation performed on its brain such that the cerebral cortex is separated from lower structures. If you just separate the cerebrum, it's called the decorticate cat. And if you sort of take away the whole brain, you have the decerebrate cat. There's some alterations in the procedure that so that the cat can still breathe, and the cat cannot bear its weight, so it has to be suspended in a little sling. So my apologies to all the cat lovers out here, but cats have been very important to figure out how motor systems work. And basically the idea is if you have a decerebrate cat and you see a motor behavior, that means the motor behavior is coming from the spinal cord. And something that we've learned is that the spinal cord has a map. Within the spinal cord, we have 3 different kind of neurons as well. We have alpha motor neurons that are going to the muscles and telling them to contract. We have A gamma motor neurons that are going to muscle spindles and regulating the sensitivity of a sensory system in the muscles. And then we have interneurons so that the different levels of the spinal cord, different halves of the spinal cord, all can coordinate information and reflexes. So here's the map in your spinal cord. So you have a dorsal horn. Remember, that's the sensory stuff. We've talked about that. There's kind of an intermediate zone with a lot of interneurons, but there's a map in your spinal cord. So the muscles, the distal muscles that are doing flexion are in this area. The distal muscles that are extensors are in this area. The muscles that control your girdles, and that would be the shoulders or the hips, are in this area. And then we have the muscles in the axis, which would be the torso and the pelvis and that sort of thing, are contained here. Now you're saying, well, that's not much of a map. Well, maybe not. It is not the most detailed map in the spinal cord, but there is one. Motor neurons that are going to the same parts of the body run together, and you can find them in this ventral horn, or also called the anterior horn. And so when we think about the spinal cord, we think about reflexes. So if you're going to be responding to some kind of stimulus, you have to be able to know what the stimulus is. So we need a receptor. That receptor neuron depolarizes in response to some kind of stimulus. That information is sent through an afferent neuron to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system is our integrator, and in this case, it's going to be the spinal cord. So a spinal reflex uses the spinal cord as a control center. A cranial reflex uses the brain as a control center. That integrator is going to figure out what the stimulus is, what's the appropriate response, activate the right things, and then the outward pathway, the motor pathway, is the efferent neuron that's going to synapse on an effector, and in this case would be a skeletal muscle. So what's our receptor system? Well, muscle spindles and Golgi tendons. So first we want to talk about muscle spindles. So here's your tendon, here's the belly of the muscle, and within the muscle is a sensory receptor. So there's sort of like a little capsule, and it's a fluid bag, and we have all kinds of channels in here. And then on either side are muscles. And when these guys contract, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. When these guys contract, and maybe I need a different color here because I don't see what I'm doing here. When these guys contract like this and like this, what it does is pulls on the receptor. And I just remembered something. This is not labeled correctly. This is actually the spindle, and this is actually the capsule. These two things have been labeled wrong, all right? So that pulls on this, it depolarizes, and then it sends action potentials to the central nervous system. And then that tells you that the muscle's getting stretched. Now, in addition, in the tendon, we see another set of receptors. Those are the Golgi tendon organs. And when this muscle contracts really strongly, then this is going to send impulses to the CNS to say that a huge contraction is going on. So let's think about how the muscle spindles work. So here's some muscle spindles in somebody's bicep, and they are picking up a load. So this reminds me of one of those exercise balls. So it's, this is a little 5-pound weight or whatever it is. So it's sitting in this person's hand. And the weight of this ball is stretching this muscle. So when you put a passive stretch on this muscle, this stretches the little capsule. We have mechanically gated channels in there. They depolarize. A receptor neuron reaches threshold, and a set of action potentials are sent to the central nervous system. The more intense the stretch, the higher the frequency of action potentials. So here's how the reflex kind of works. I have a passive stretch, or I have a weight that causes a stretch in the muscle. This stretches the spindle, depolarizes it more. I have a higher of action potentials going to the CNS. The central nervous system then activates an alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron causes the extrafusal fibers, those are the fibers that make the muscle contract, cause them to contract, and then you can maintain the weight of the ball. So this is a negative feedback mechanism. The stimulus stretches the muscle. The response is to contract the muscle and maintain the length of the muscle so that you maintain that load. Notice that as the muscle contracts, we remove the stretch on the muscle spindle, and now the rate of action potentials decreases. Sometimes what we can do is a process called co-activation. Co-activation means you activate two kinds of neurons. Not only do we have the A alpha motor neurons that control the extrafusal fibers, these are the ones that make the muscle contract, but we have a gamma motor neuron that activates the intrafusal fibers and increases the sensitivity. So that when these muscles contract, we stretch this little spindle. That sends a high level of action potentials. And then that can kind of drive the activity from the alpha motor neurons. So as you continue to contract and as you lift the ball, instead of unloading the spindle, you have a constant report coming from the spindle. So here we can have a physician or a physician assistant or a nurse practitioner. It's going to take a hammer and hit somebody on this little tendon. Why do they do that? Because this stretches over the patella and ends up stretching the quadriceps. And that's an artificial way of activating all of the muscle spindles, stretching all of the muscle spindles in that muscle, which sends sensory information back to the spinal cord. Synapses on motor neurons that go to the same quadriceps muscle, and you get a contraction of the muscle and the leg kicks. That's a stretch reflex. Notice that this reflex only has one synapse in this area right here. You have a sensory neuron synapsing on a motor neuron to the very same muscle. But we can make this pathway more complicated because we can have collateral that synapses on a inhibitory neuron, and we can inhibit the antagonistic muscle, so we relax the hamstring while we're contracting the quadriceps, and we also have information going up to our brain so that we're aware that we're doing that. So when someone uses a reflex hammer to test a stretch reflex, that's an assessment tool. Physiologically, what stretch reflexes are for is that when the presence of a load, I'm standing there and you hand me a really heavy package, and that stretches my arms, it stretches my leg muscles, and I contract in response to maintain the load so that I don't fall down. Or I pick up a suitcase and it's really heavy, I stretch my arm, the muscle spindles activate the muscle, so I maintain a contraction and I don't drop the suitcase. That's what this reflex is for physiologically. We test it clinically with the reflex hammer and the tendon tap. Now, what about the Golgi tendon organ? Well, it's found in the tendon here and sends information back towards the CNS. So the tendon has to be stretched. So we're not going to get much output when the muscle is relaxed. If we passively stretch the muscle, we get a little bit of action potentials from the Golgi tendon. Not a whole lot, though. It's when we contract the muscle and contract the muscle strongly that we really put a stretch on that tendon, and then we get a report back to the CNS. What's our response to this information? Well, if we stretch the tendon, the Golgi tendon, then we get action potentials going back to the spinal cord, and we synapse on inhibitory neurons. Those inhibitory neurons then go to the alpha motor neuron that's innervating the quadriceps here. My pen is just not writing very well. It goes right here. I relax this muscle. So if I tap the tendon and stretch the muscle contracts in response. If I over-contract the muscle, then I stretch the tendon, or the Golgi tendon organ, and I inhibit the contraction. So both of these things are negative feedback mechanisms. The stretch reflex enables us to maintain a load. The Golgi tendon reflex keeps us from over-contracting and damaging our muscles and tendons. Because we have an interneuron here, we have two synapses. So this is not a monosynaptic reflex, it's a polysynaptic reflex. We can have more complicated reflexes, so something like the withdrawal reflex. Here's a little tack that we're stepping on or sitting on or whatever that activates a pain neuron, a nociceptor. That information then goes to the central nervous system. We activate an interneuron, also called an association neuron. This is an interneuron. And then I activate a pathway, perhaps going to some other body part, so that I contract a muscle and I get my skin away from that noxious stimulus. So this is the basics of the withdrawal reflex. So here I am stepping on a nail. That information goes to the spinal cord, and I activate a pathway where I lift up my leg and get it off of the nociceptor. I also want to support the base leg and keep it contracting so I maintain my balance. Or I might even have a cross extensor where this leg would allow me to step away, so I'd extend away, while this leg is flexing. And I pull my leg away from the noxious stimulus. So we have some very complicated reflexes. We've talked about the stretch reflex. We've talked about the Golgi tendon reflex. We've talked about withdrawal reflex and the cross extension reflex, which is just an extension of the withdrawal reflex. It's just a more noxious stimulus, and we activate more interneurons. So there's very complex circuitry in the spinal cord. It is not just an elevator. In addition, we have groups of neurons that act as pattern generators. I always think about this when I see my dog Panda, and sometimes she's wagging her tail back and forth, and sometimes her tail whips around like a little helicopter. I am sure there's a central pattern generator in her spinal cord that's operating her tail, so she doesn't have to think about how she's whipping her tail around. I think there are central pattern generators in the spinal cord. From what it tells us from the cerebrate cat is that there's a coordination between the forelimbs and the hind limbs. Or if you think about how a person walks, they swing their arms as they step their legs. So as I step my left leg out, I swing out my right arm. And then as I step out my right leg, I swing out my left arm. And I don't have to think about doing that. Also, think about newborns. They have brains and spinal cords that are all connected, but they are not fully matured. The myelination and all the connections and the branching and that kind of stuff is not completed in that newborn. However, you can set a newborn, you can support their weight, and you will see stepping reflexes. You will see them do a stepping kind of thing. That comes from the spinal cord. Babies can't maintain their weight. They don't have all their brainstem pathways and their corticospinal tract all mature, but they have reflexes in the spinal cord. So your spinal cord is actually quite sophisticated. Now, what happens when you hurt your spinal cord? Well, initially what happens is spinal shock, and you lose electrical activity in your spinal neurons. So you have the inability to activate your muscles. So that's called plegia. So quadriplegia means you can't move anything below the neck or the shoulders. Paraplegia means you can't move things below the waist. You also can have areflexia, and that, in other words, tendon taps and Golgi tendon reflexes are not working. You don't have reflex responses. Now, recovery from a spinal injury can take a long, long time. It can take months. And what can happen then is when people start to recover, they have new synapses that have formed in the spinal cord, and they've lost inhibitory centers coming from the brain and brainstem. And so people can have hyperreflexia. They can have really intense reflexes, very brisk reflexes. They can have muscle tightness that is very difficult to relax, that's called spasticity. They can have reflexes that sort of reverberate. So, the foot flexes and then points, and flexes and points, and it just does that in sort of a reverberating sort of way. And that's a chronic effect we call clonus. So reflexes and motor function are chronically impaired because of spinal injury.